If you watched the last episode and thought, but how do we know that Christianity is the ice cream of world religions? In other words, how do we know for sure that Jesus is the truth as he claimed to be, and that the other gods and prophets are not the truth? How do we know that for sure? Well, I would say, to be honest, that would be a whole other series. The evidence for Jesus and Christianity would take a long time to unpack. But there is just one piece of evidence that I want to quickly point to here in this episode before we carry on with the rest of the series. Just one piece of evidence that I think points quite clearly towards Jesus being the truth. And I can possibly summarize it by saying that Christianity simply has the best track record at producing good societies, honest societies, decent, pleasant societies, the kind of places that you just want to live in. In other words, Christianity just works in a way that no other religion ever has. You see, for many centuries, the world was quite neatly divided into clear religious zones, and this is very helpful for the purposes of analysis. The English-speaking world and parts of Western Europe developed with a Reformed Christian underpinning. In South America and Eastern Europe, the prevailing religion was Roman Catholicism. In the Middle East and North Africa, it was majority Muslim for many centuries. In India, you had the prevalence of Hinduism. In the Far East, it was various expressions of Buddhism. And then sprinkled across several countries since the 20th century, as we've seen, we've also had many attempts at atheistic societies or godless societies. Now, what has become very apparent in the passing of time, this is very, very noticeable, is that it is the historically Christian nations. It is the ones who are founded upon, built upon, the ones that have developed according to Christian ideals, the ones where there's been the most churches, where there's been the largest concentration of Christians, the ones where people have known their Bible the best, the ones where people have known Jesus the best. It is those nations that have become the most prosperous, healthy, and pleasant places in which to live. I know this is going to cause outrage when I say it, but I'm just going to say it anyway. Some cultures have developed to be more pleasant, more honest, more decent, more kind, more good than others. Some cultures are better than others. Indeed, a graphic that I've often referred to is this one by Transparency International. This organization annually produces a report listing all of the nations of the world, and then it ranks them in terms of corruption levels. Now, as you can see from this graphic, the least corrupt nations in the world, that is the ones in yellow, tend to center very noticeably, I think, around North America, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And what is the common denominator? In all of those nations, it's Christianity. These are the ones that were founded upon, built upon, the ones that have developed and evolved according to Christian ideals. This is where the largest concentration of Christians have always been for the past few centuries anyway, in the world, in these nations. So this is the top 20 least corrupt nations in the world, and then alongside I put the prevailing traditional historical faith of that country next to it. 17 of the top 20 least corrupt nations are historically, traditionally Christian nations. Now, for any honest person, this should stir some kind of curiosity. It seems that Christianity is proving uniquely capable amongst all the religions of the world. Christianity is proving uniquely capable of sanctifying human beings and therefore providing a foundation for honest, decent, good societies. And I have to emphasize, there's nothing intrinsically better about the people in those nations. That's very important to point out here. These nations, prior to the arrival of Christianity in pagan times, in pre-Christian times, were savage places. They were terrible places. I'll just talk about the UK and Scotland because that's what I know best. In the old pagan religions here in Scotland, before Christianity, there was human sacrifice going on. There was even suggestions of cannibalism going on. For example, there's a well here in Scotland, up in Burghead, where they used to carry out ritual drownings. They would ritually drown human beings as a sacrifice to their pagan gods. We have many stone circles around this area where pagan sacrifices were carried out as well, possibly in conjunction with what the moon was doing. It seemed that when the moon was in a particular place in the sky, that's when they would carry out their sacrifices. There's also things like the Beltane Fire Festival. That was a pre-Christian festival that used to be carried out here. In fact, it's kind of been revived a little bit in recent years. This is in Edinburgh. I went there a few years ago in 2014 as part of a Fuel Project series. I wanted to record them. I wanted to do some interviews, to witness, to evangelize to them. And it's a dark, dark, evil thing. So this is not us. The fact that Western nations are comparatively more yellow than the others is not down to us. We cannot take credit for this. We can only ascribe our moral advancement to one source, and that is Jesus Christ. He takes all the credit and all the glory for any blessings and moral advancement that we've ever had. From the moment our ancestors received the gospel, they began to be transformed by it, sanctified by the Spirit's power and by the word of God. All blessings that we have ever had in Western society come from God. Now, the thing is, most Westerners today don't even realize this. They don't even realize that they've inherited their moral code from the Bible. I read a tweet recently that said, "Interesting how unaware we are that so much of our cultural thinking in the West has come from Christianity. We assume forgiveness, sacrifice, love of one's enemies, sanctity of life come from inside us. They don't." That tweet speaks the truth. We believe in these things: forgiveness, sacrifice, love of one's enemies, sanctity of life. We believe in these things because Jesus Christ taught these things 2,000 years ago, and at the time they were revolutionary ideas. Nobody had ever heard stuff like this before. His disciples then carried those teachings across to Europe. Missionaries came to the West. They came to Ireland, Scotland, the UK, and these ideas were then handed down to us through the centuries and now come to us today. Now, of course, as the West continues to abandon God in the postmodern age and abandon the teachings of Christ, the source of our sanctification and blessings and happiness, it is likely that corruption will start rising again here in the future. Indeed, it already is rising. Whenever I refer to this Transparency International chart, I always have people replying something to the effect of, "You think that the West isn't corrupt?" First of all, that's not what this chart is saying. It's not saying that there's no corruption in the West. This chart is saying that the West is merely comparatively less corrupt than the rest of the world. In other words, if you think it's corrupt in the West, then try Russia. Try China. There you will really see what corruption's all about. But secondly, since the West is now abandoning Christianity, the source of its sanctification, I agree that we can now expect to see things deteriorating here in the times ahead. The West will become more corrupt on its current trajectory, and this graphic will become less and less relevant. However, that's why it's important that I present this information now. I imagine that in the future, people are going to be looking around at one another mournfully, saying, "What happened to our society? What happened? How did we lose this pleasant place that we once knew? It used to be so good here. It used to be so lovely. What happened? How did we lose this?" And the answer is that you lost it because you forgot God. You rejected God. You turned your back on the source of that blessing. You rejected the source of the blessing, the source of your sanctification. And from the moment that you did that, society began declining. A society cannot exist for very long without its moral foundation. It cannot exist for very long without its moral foundation. And the moral foundation in the West has always been Christianity, or at least for about 2,000 years, Christianity. So whatever happens from here on in, I just want it to be known that when the West adhered most closely to the Bible and attended church weekly and embraced Jesus as Lord and put Jesus at the head of our nation, our society became the most decent, pleasant, and beautiful in the world. It became the envy of the world, in fact. How can I say that it became the envy of the world? Well, because these are the places that everyone is trying to get into. Indeed, you may notice that large-scale immigration in the world today largely tends to flow only in one direction. Have you ever noticed that? It flows towards the Christian nations and never in reverse. Remember how I talked about the days of the Soviet Union and how they had to build walls to keep people in the communist side because everyone was trying to flee to the free side to partake in the blessings of the free side, and how we could really learn something by that. Well, in a similar way, the majority of immigrants today are trying to get into the Christian nations to partake in the blessings of the Christian nations, and we can learn something by that as well. After all, there are no floods of Norwegians risking life and limb to get into Iran. That's not a problem that Iran has. Everybody's trying to get in there. There are not thousands of Canadians attempting to infiltrate North Korea. There are no caravans of Danish people or Dutch people or British people desperate to reach Yemen. These countries don't have that problem. Nobody's trying to get in there. Large-scale immigration typically all flows in one direction, towards Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, Western Europe, and admittedly a few others. But in general, it flows towards the Christian nations, the ones that were built on Christianity. Why? Because these are the most pleasant places to stay. Indeed, only Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong really buck the trend in the top 20 list of least corrupt nations. And as a result, Japan always features quite highly in the list of places that people want to live. And since Singapore and Hong Kong were in the British Empire for around 150 years, there's even quite a strong Christian influence there as well. In fact, I can go one stage further. This is not PC, but I'm going to say it anyway. I could even say that in this age of globalization, that Christianity has even been responsible for improving the other religions a little bit and the nations where Christianity is not particularly dominant. For example, in pre-colonial times, when India knew only Hinduism, they would practice sati. This is the burning of widows on the funeral pyres of their husbands. So when their husband died, they were expected to get on there and be sacrificed alongside their husband while they were still living. Now, the Christian influence came into India through the British Empire and they put a stop to sati. They didn't allow it. And now if you go to Hindu countries, if you go to India, they don't do it anymore. But that wasn't a conclusion they came to themselves. That was Christianity improving things. That was Christianity improving the lot of the Indians. So I believe that the evidence is clear that Christianity is indeed the ice cream of world religions. And even if you don't believe that it's true, the evidence is clear that it works in a way that none of the others do. It is proven unique in being able to sanctify human beings. Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, atheism, Buddhism, they've all had the same opportunity, the same chance as Christianity to create a society in their own image. And the fact is that none of them have that same track record. None of them have matched the influence of Jesus. None of them have been able to sanctify their citizens in the way that Christianity has. And in fact, some of them have downright terrible records. I mean, again, this is not PC, but let's be real here. When Afghanistan fell back into Taliban hands in 2021, and the prospect of living under Islamic law became a reality again for these people, they were scrambling to the airport, clinging onto plane wheels and wings for dear life, preferring to risk everything rather than go back living under that regime. That should tell us something. And where do they hope to end up? In historically Christian nations. When there were problems in Syria, where did everyone flee to? Other Middle Eastern nations? No, they all fled towards Europe. So again, why would Christians consider absorbing anything of those philosophies into our own way of life? Why, for example, would a Christian country blend anything of Islamic Sharia law into their own civilization when by looking to countries where Sharia law has prevailed for centuries, it has produced pretty much nothing but corruption? Isn't it clear that it would be an act of self-harm to mix anything of those philosophies into our own way of life? Isn't it clear, in fact, that we had something special here and quite unique, something quite unusual here in the West? The norm in the world is for the map to be red. So can't we see that we've had something really quite unique here to be yellow at all? And can't we see that the better idea then is to dearly hold to that truth that we have and that which has served us so well and which has sanctified us, and even work to spread Christian ideas to other parts of the world so that they can share in similar blessings? So instead of everyone trying to scramble to the yellow zones, why don't we say, well, you can be yellow too. You can have these blessings in your own country. You can have all of this, but all you need is Jesus. Make Jesus your Lord as our ancestors did. Put him on the throne of your lives and on the throne of your nation, and you can share, you will share in these blessings. And this is a message for us in the West as well right now, as our generation now rejects Jesus and turns its back on Jesus, the source of our blessing, the source of our sanctification. This is a message we need to hear. We need to put Jesus back on the throne of our lives and on the throne of our nation, so that we don't lose all of these blessings that we've had for so long. If we are to unify around anything, then first let's unify around the truth. And second of all, if you're not yet convinced that Jesus is the truth, as he claims, then at least unite around the thing that works. But on both counts, you're going to end up back at the very same place. You're going to end up at the feet of Jesus Christ.